The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Alpine joined the launch party with the reveal of its new car at Enstone today, and it's the first team to have a completely genuine new car on display for us to take a look at. But what should we expect from the Anglo-French team in 2024, and just how different is its new car concept? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me with all the answers are Gary Anderson, Mark Hughes and Damien Smith. We've got a mix of on-the-ground flavour and in-depth technical analysis for the Alpine Launch podcast. I was at Enstone, and in the first part, I had a chat with Damien Smith about the launch event itself. And then later on, we'll hear from the dream team of Mark Hughes and Gary Anderson to take a close look at the car. But before we get into all the details on Alpine, I wanted to tell you about an amazing offer that we have on right now for the Race Members Club. For a limited period, we're offering a 1-month free trial membership, meaning you can enjoy everything the Race Members Club has to offer, including exclusive members-only podcasts, a reduced ad environment on the website, exclusive access to the race.com comments section, member discounts, and much more, before we take any money from you. Just yesterday, we posted a members-only podcast featuring full-length interviews from the Sauber launch, and we have lots of exciting extra audio content planned for testing too. So what are you waiting for? Sign up today and enjoy a month on us. You can find full details on how to join by clicking the link in the description to this episode. And now it's over to Enstone to hear from Damien Smith and me. Well, you join us here so we can set the scene. Sat in a car in the Enstone car park just after the Alpine launch. Cars make very, very good recording studios. I'm joined by Damien Smith, who you may have heard on the podcast before, friend of the race, author of the masterpiece book on Benetton Rebels of Formula One, isn't it?
That's the one, Ed. Thank you very much. Yes, lovely to be back. Thank you for having me.
Got the plug in early, that was the important thing, and to establish your credentials. But we've just seen the launch. What did you make of it in general and the general tone?
Well, it was an interesting one. Bruno Famin was very careful not to make any predictions for where they were going to, how they were going to do this year, any targets, any specific targets, because they've been caught out before, haven't they, on that one? And I mean, I think there was a recognition that they had a terrible year last year overall. Okay, Bruno was keen to say how they improved towards the end of the year. Once he was in charge of the team as a team principal, just so happens. But I think they've got to get better, haven't they? And the drivers, both very positive, very optimistic, as they tend to be at this time of year. They're facing this incredibly long season of 24 races, and I think both of them made a key point about development of the car. So what they start with in Bahrain isn't going to be what they finish with. I asked Esteban about the McLaren example from last year, and he said, absolutely, that's showing the way of where we need to be. We need to be able to respond and react to what we've got and improve over the course of the year, and they both want to be winning races. That's a tall order for them, obviously. But this is a team that desperately needs to improve.
The really interesting thing was Esteban Ocon was talking. I did ask him about why things are going to be different, because he's been at this team a long time. He joined in 2020, so this is his 5th season. He's out of contract at the end of the year, incidentally, as a little footnote. But I did say, what's actually different? Because there's lots of optimism, but we go through this optimism change cycle with this team, and it goes nowhere. And he said the right sort of things, but I do get the impression the team still feels it's a bit into the unknown. I think there's still that feeling of, well, we think we've done everything right, but history tells us we do struggle a bit.
There's that big element of unknown in this period of incredible technology we've all got, and the Formula One teams have never been better equipped. They still don't know, and that's the beauty of this sport and why we're all still hooked on it. He's got his own personal targets, he said, Esteban, and he knows every year is a crucial year for Formula One drivers. We know that, but he's out of contract, as you say, at the end of the year. Opportunities are opening up. He has to be 100% at every race. He mentioned that he was ill towards the end of last year. Just the toll of that incessant schedule took it out of him, and he said over the winter he's been trying to prepare to not let that happen again, and that's going to be key for him, just to be there when he gets any opportunity. He's got to take it, and Gasly's in the same boat, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's very difficult, particularly for a driver like Ocon, in terms of fitness, because he's very tall. He's geometrically challenging, shall we say, to get in the car. They did say he was super comfortable in this car. Did the seat fit, and it was just 2 minutes. Everything was good. Very different to last year. But yeah, he did trail off a bit at the end of last year. And there's a really interesting dynamic in the team with those two drivers, because there were signs Pierre Gasly was starting to get the initiative late on, and Esteban talked about bad luck, and obviously he's added the fact he felt a little bit more run down, a bit ill. So that's always one of the most volatile and interesting driver pairings given their history.
Yes, and Gasly did mention a couple of times today about how much better he feels this time around coming into the season than last year, which was his first year at the team. And I think it's probably important we don't overlook how big a change that was for him, and how much new stuff was coming at him from a team that's got a base here at Enstone, and then of course the engine facility in Vieri, which is a challenge in itself. There was a lot coming at him last year, and plus the team was obviously underperforming. So no wonder he's feeling better a year on in coming in. They both need a good year, don't they?
Absolutely, and they'll both be looking at each other thinking, yeah, this is the year I bury you and make this my team. And that's how racing drivers think. But yeah, there's a lot at stake when it comes to that. But what did you make of the launch in general? I'm sure some listening will have watched the stream. It was in their sort of hospitality space that's in the old CFD centre here at Enstone. That's sort of underground, isn't it? Obviously you know plenty about the development of this particular site, but it was a nice low level launch, and I mean that in sort of a positive way, and that here's a car, real car, here's some drivers, here's a few people talking, and right at the heart of the team. Yeah, it was nicely done, and everyone was very we had lots of time with the drivers, lots of time with Bruno, so I think it was a good launch as these things go. We don't have enough in the metal launches these days. It was quite nice to go to one, and it was an added bonus for us today, of course, for those of us who aren't just focused on Formula One, was to see the new World Endurance Championship hypercar. This is a massive year for Alpine on two fronts. Formula One they desperately need to improve on last year and to justify the investment in that Formula One team. Meanwhile, they're going into an extremely competitive WEC field, Le Mans 24 Hours. Ferrari came in last year, won the Le Mans 24 Hours first time out, so they're being very careful about this being a learning year. At the same time, you can't afford much of a learning year, whether you're in Formula One or in sports car racing. So it was a nice launch, very covered a lot of ground. It was also quite nice to see Mick Schumacher as well, who was really seems to be revelling in his new role on the sports car team. Yeah, he'll be enjoying being back out there and racing. Obviously, the Formula One doors seem to be closing for him. I don't think Mercedes is a realistic possibility for next year. Still there as a reserve, though, I believe. So still an opportunity, potentially, if they need a fill-in. But, yeah, I think that tonal thing for this whole Alpine operation is very interesting, because they have been burned by the past. Obviously, this is the Bruno Famin era now, and there are lots of question marks about the team and how much Renault interference there is, and a lot's changed actually just all the way down the team. They've got COOs now appointed at Enstone and Vieri, the engine side. Do you think this team is in a position to avoid that historic problem of the Renault ownership? Because it's always been very, very tricky, going right back to the Carlos Ghosn days, long before he hid in a packing crate and disappeared from certain parts of the world. Obviously, his confidence and interest in F1 was a bit low, and it's almost felt like the ownership endured the Formula One team rather than really embraced it. Do you get a sense that's changing much? Luca Di Maio was here today.
Yes, I mean they're making a concerted effort. I think they know the problems. So really, you'd think they're going to find a way to improve it. This team's been so up and down over the decades, hasn't it? They've had moments, obviously the great moments of world championships, and then so many middling years. I'm not sure. Has enough changed from last year so that we're going to see a huge difference this year in Alpine? Are they suddenly going to do an Aston Martin style leap forward in performance at the start of the year? We're going to be kind of guessing here. I don't see it from what we've seen so far. Obviously, they're talking good fight. It's that time of year when everyone does. But I worry for Bruno Famin as well. I mean, here's a guy who was probably looking towards his retirement. Suddenly, he was thrust into the team principal role, which is very different to the overseeing role he had before. And my first question today to him was, I thought this was supposed to be like a temporary thing, an interim. And he's, no, I'm fully committed. But I wonder, does he really need this at his stage of life?
Particularly if things get a bit tough. He's still in that honeymoon period, because they did have a bit of an uptick in the second half of last season. It wasn't massive, but they were scoring a few more points per weekend, still not enough for a team of that size. There was some general progress in terms of the way the team worked. I do think there's been a little bit of an out with the old, in with the new in terms of the way the race team's operating. Obviously, Alan Permain left last year, so the way things have shuffled around, obviously it's now Julian Rouse, son of Andy Rouse, the touring car legend, now the sporting director, and some little changes further down in terms of the way the organisation works in the garage. So there's lots of little rays of light, but I still see it as a team that's going to be bouncing around roughly where it is. They were 6th last year, could be 6 again this year, could be 5th, maybe with a fair wind 4th, things go a bit wrong 7th. So it still all amounts to the same thing they've been doing for years, doesn't it?
It does, really. It does. And I think mid-season, if the Mercedes situation hasn't resolved itself and they haven't named a replacement for Hamilton, Ocon's clearly, I think, going to be fancying his chances with his links with Toto Wolff and his links with Mercedes. And he needs to see a significant improvement this year, not to be looking ahead. I mean, these two guys, both drivers. I mean, Pierre Gasly is 28 today. The day we're here at the launch, it was his birthday. He was flying off to Paris for some celebrations tonight, I think. They're both young guys. We're seeing careers going into their late 30s, and in Alonso's case, obviously, well into the 40s, and the same with Lewis. So they've got long careers ahead of them. This is a crucial time in your late 20s, though, to really find your place where you can actually start getting some big results, and they need that season to be this year.
Yeah, Ocon's interesting. I get the impression that he's not going all out and thinking, I'm definitely going to be at Alpine next year. Obviously he's out of contract, so he can't know that, but I feel like he sees options as open even before the Mercedes drive became available. I must admit, I see him as a bit of an outsider for the Mercedes drive. You're right, he'll fancy his chances. But they sort of looked at him and thought he wouldn't be dramatically different to, say, a Bottas level, and felt Russell was better. Has anything changed on that? I don't know. Audi like the look of him, Sauber. So that's probably, if he's not at Alpine next year, I'd say that's the most likely destination. But he's an interesting player in the driver market because he's quite a significant piece, but he's not one of the most significant pieces, which is always a position of opportunity and terror for a driver, isn't it?
Yeah, I sensed talking to him that he knows, as I said earlier, every weekend he's got to be showing something. He's got to be showing that he belongs and that he deserves something more than what he's got at the moment. And I think one of the things I said was, is this a distraction, having the this future prospects? You have to think about it as a racing driver. You can't just live in the present. At the same time, you have to live in the present. He's got that tension. And what he did say is his management team hasn't changed. He's got the right people in his corner. He says to look ahead so that he can focus on the present. And he's got that long 24 season to think about, psychologically and physically tough. At the same time, he's fighting for his future. It's really interesting, I think, from that point of view.
And actually, Ocon's a real street fighter of a character as well. It's a miracle he made it to F1, really, with the background he came from, in terms of didn't have much money behind him. He got some backing from things like Genie, the Gravity Sports Management Scheme early on, which helped him get through karting, etc. But he's always had to deliver in order to have a future, and sort of hauled himself up pretty improbably into F1. And he's had a long and pretty successful career so far. So yeah, I'm interested to see how that goes. But yeah, it's to come back to this team as a whole. It's such a strange team, isn't it? And I mean that in a positive way, because even if you just look around, we're in the car park, like I said. This car park's, even by F1 team car parks, it's famously difficult to be able to park in. There are some empty spaces today, but that's because it's launch day. But it's a tricky one if you work here. Space is very restricted, and obviously it's grown in an interesting way because it's in the countryside. You know, you can be 400 metres from this site and you wouldn't know there's an F1 team here, other than the fact that you almost inevitably drive past staff having a run in the middle of the day, generally, as they seem to do. But it's such a curious sort of setup. But that's why it'd be wonderful to see this team working, because it's really got character that goes all the way back to the early days of this team as Tolman.
Yeah, I love coming here. I think it has got real character. I was talking to one of the team members today, and they were saying, the core middle bit of the building is essentially what was built here in the winter of '92 and opened. The team came back from the flyaways at that season into the new bright white factory. Everything was white apparently, and it's still a bit like that now. And it's basically expanded from that core middle bit of the old factory, and it's got a real presence about it. I came from a northerly direction this time. I usually come from the south, but I've moved in the last year, so I came from the north, and I almost missed the turning because it's so tucked away. It's so easy to miss.
You've got to have the sat nav running here, or you'll miss it.
You will, absolutely. Yeah, without the sat nav, you get lost. You wouldn't find it. But it's got a real spirit about this place. It's got a great tradition, and it's people work here are very proud of it. I found that when I was doing the research for my book. The people who...
Oh, you done a book?
I did a book. Did I tell you that? I did a book. I've written a book. But people who have a connection to this team, even if they've moved on, they talk about what a great place it is to work and how there's a real, it's a bit of a cliche these days, but a real family atmosphere here. And I think you can feel that here.
Yeah, and that's why it'd be so nice to see things working well. It is curious because obviously you've got the very engine side. It's a works team, but it's the sort of most disparate works team in that regard. So making those two sides work together is very important. Bruno Famin's talked about how improvements were made in the race team track side in the back end of last year, and they've really focused more on improvements in the factory now as well. So there's lots of reason for kind of gentle optimism, I guess, is the way to look at it. The other thing just wanted to mention on the car is obviously a lot of black on the car, which we're starting to see, and it's not really black, it's just carbon fibre, isn't it? It's saving the paint seems to be the way. It's quite funny, actually, because as they've done before, they've got the BWT pink car, which people remember. You have the blue car and the pink car, and the pink car will be at a few races this year. Bruno Famin said it was more than a couple of races, but it wasn't that precise, and when we will see that. But they unveiled the car in front of us, which was the actual car, and then they did a video link to the main building in the race bay where they were unveiling the pink one. I haven't actually spoken to us. I wonder, what was your impression when that alternative livery was unveiled?
It didn't look very alternative, did it, really? I couldn't really tell much difference. I mean, liveries obviously don't really matter very much to race engineers, and they're not very exciting liveries. And we do seem to have a lot of black coloured cars on the grid for that reason. I would say they get a sort of 3 out of 10 from me for presentation from that point of view. But if it's fast, they won't care about that.
I absolutely agree with that. It was just quite funny, given they've been so strikingly pink. And I did get the impression I got from the murmurings in the room was a bit sort of, oh, that's very, very similar. It is different, but not that different. It doesn't feel like, it's not a pink car, is it?
It's not. And they made a bit of a big thing about the livery, and it was really underwhelming. So that on that point, that was probably the sort of the only sort of downside of the launch. But everything else, I was impressed with how they put themselves across today. They're starting hopefully on a good footing, but we won't know until we get to Bahrain.
Absolutely. I think that's the feeling in the team as well. They intend to shake down the car before the Bahrain test starts, but they're still finalising plans of exactly how they do that. So we will probably see that car running before the test starts on February the 21st. Thanks very much, Damien Smith. Buy his book. It is very good, and honestly it is. I have bought a copy as well as seeing a review version. So it's well worth getting. Evro Publishing if you want to order that. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again one day on this podcast, so thank you.
Thank you. Great to be back, and I promise next time I won't mention the book.
That's the only reason we bring you on. That's your USP.
Thanks, Ed. Always a pleasure.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Mark Hughes and Gary Anderson. Mark, we'll come to you first before Gary gets into the detail. The first glance at this car suggests it's kind of an evolution of the aero concept, but with big mechanical changes to try and make it all work better. And the team has talked about this being a concept change. So perhaps you can kind of reconcile that the broad brushstrokes, the talk of concept change, with the fact that probably visually to most people, it looks relatively similar.
Visually, it does look quite similar until you start looking at the detail and the side pod shapes, significantly different. But the big change that's been the internal big internal project for the last year or so is the new rear suspension, which is, although still push rod in layout, it's got very different geometry, and the whole. They believe that that's going to fix a lot of last year's cars' ills in terms of the through corner balance and having this combination of a good acceptable responsive rotation early in the corner without that then leading to instability in the early part of the corner. And that's been the sort of a generic problem with these cars because, you know, they tend to understeer at a certain speed and oversteer at another speed, and trying to get that consistent balance through the corner. With a very powerful underfloor, which is quite difficult to tune, is what's been the limiting factor. And so this is what they believe will help them do that. They've tweaked the aerodynamics. They've made a lot of how much more volume they've created in the internal bodywork. But they believe that the mechanical changes are what's going to make a big difference.
And of course, all about the interaction of the aero characteristics and the mechanical platform with this generation of cars. Gary, you've been poring over the details, so what do you make of it? What's the most eye-catching thing for you, and do you think this is the right direction?
Well, as Mark said, yeah, I mean, it's all about the suspension managing that aerodynamic platform. You know, it's a bit like an airplane. If the wings could just, you know, twist, change angle on their own free will, the pilot would have a bit of a nightmare keeping the airplane in the air. So, and a Formula One car is no different. You know, these cars are producing, you know, over 3 ton of downforce at a fairly high speed, and you know that aerodynamic load has a centre of pressure which is working on the car. And if that's shooting up and down the car, then the car will become a nightmare. So, suspension control of that aerodynamic platform is critically important. You need the good aerodynamic platform first, because, you know, with normal passive suspension as such, you know, you can't do anything with it. Everybody's saying, oh, we should go to active suspension again, and you know that would all be about just controlling the aerodynamic platform, but it isn't legal. So you know you have to try and do it mechanically with the suspension system you've got. So again, as Red Bull have done for the last couple of years, they ran a lot of anti-dive in the front suspension, a lot of anti-lift on the rear suspension. And, the anti-dive is quite important, but it's not the end of the world because you can get away with it if you run just the car stiffer, basically. But the anti-lift is critically important because the last thing you need whenever you hit the brake pedal and want to turn into the corner is the rear of the car just bounces up into the air because you get the weight transfer. It doesn't matter what you get the weight transfer coming off it. And if you got the aerodynamic transfer as well because of the attitude change, then it's just a double whammy. So the only thing you can do, you can't really change the weight transfer. You can lower the centre of gravity and you do as much as you can. But, practically all the cars are in the same sort of ballpark. But what you can do is control the centre of pressure. So that's what really the suspension stuff's all about.
And when you look at the suspension on this, is there enough you can actually see to pass much judgment on it? Because, of course, a lot of the detail is on the inbuilt stuff, the stuff you can't really see, but you can see the geometry. So is there much for you to draw on there?
Well, the front suspension has got the anti-dive on the top front wishbone. It's one of those sort of situations where you can only do so much. The anti-dive on the front suspension ends up making the car a little bit dead. It doesn't quite give the driver as much feeling as he wants from it. So it's sometimes a bit easier to just lock the brakes because you're not getting the feedback from the movement of the front of the car. But I don't think they've gone for as much, let's say, as Red Bull had last year. They've gone for more than they had last year, I believe. It's still the pushrod front suspension system, which again, it's a little confusing. There's debate whether the pull rod or the push rod is better aerodynamically. I think it's, to be honest, for me, the judgment on that's still out there somewhere. I keep pushing about the pull rod suspension being able to get a higher rising rate on the front suspension system, so it allows you to run softer springs, but still have that support whenever you're braking or at high speed because of the rate change between the wheel and the front spring or torsion bar as it is. So that they've done a bit on. If you take a front suspension, they've done a bit, but they haven't done as much as probably some other cars will have. And they haven't gone to the pull rod, so they've stuck with what they know. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff inboard there that we don't see, so they'll be optimizing of that. As far as the rear suspension layout is concerned, it is different. It's quite difficult to see it in the pictures we've seen. But it does look like it's a sort of more of a multi-link system rather than two wishbones, a top and bottom wishbone. It looks like the forward leg of the top wishbone is separated from the rear leg, so they connect differently to the upright. And again, it's probably got quite a lot of anti-lift on it. But again, it is a pushrod suspension as last year. So overall, they may have different characteristics, kinematics on how they control the rear tire and the car. But hopefully, part of the system that they've got there, which is, as I say, is really difficult to see, will be to keep the rear of the car down whenever you hit the brake pedal. And only time will tell whether they've done enough of it.
And Mark, one of the interesting things, as you alluded to, was the modifying the way the car works to make sure the engine's working, or the power unit's working as efficiently as possible, avoiding what Matt Harmon described last year as parasitic losses, which is obviously areas where you lose some of that engine power because it's just being lost to the various things, and nothing's obviously 100% efficient. Do you think that the kind of aggregate of all these little bits and pieces they've done can make a dent in that small but slightly irritating for them power deficit?
Matt Harmon last year described it as small but manageable, for the remaining 2 years of this power unit formula. They'd campaigned the FIA to have a holiday from the engine freeze to get themselves up, fully up to speed, but that was rejected. So they've said, well, we can work around it to an extent, partly through the installation, which they're talking about, getting everything as efficient as possible in terms of, even went to the detail in the launch of saying, we've got the exhaust to come straight out rather than have any curvature in it, so there's no pressure drop, so it doesn't affect the engine. They talked about it seems that this engine needs a lower inlet plenum temperature than the others. So that has a compromising effect on the car's aero. So they've tried to balance that out a bit more efficiently than they had last year. And the other thing he mentioned was duty cycle, which he didn't go in any further depth on that. But what it implies is they're probably just going to run it harder and accept that they're going to use more engines and take the engine penalties when they have to. Rather than just accept the limitations. So yeah, it's not a team that is aspiring to win the championship. It's a team that's aspiring to become more competitive and close the gap. So I think, given that they have that known limitation, it probably makes sense. And also sometimes when you start out with a known disadvantage, you end up in looking at areas that you wouldn't have otherwise done it and finding something that you might not have expected to find, or finding more than you expected to find. And that's happened to this team before. They started out with a ridiculously overweight and slow revving engine with the V10, the 111 degree V10. And the way that they got around that was to give it a big fat torque curve and lots of, very efficient on fuel, and so didn't have to start as heavy, and it had great traction because it was a bit heavy, and the Michelin rear tyres really responded well to that. And that's, even after they got rid of that engine and got a more competitive power unit, that's what took them to those 2005 and 06 championships, that concept of car. And I'm sure Red Bull have found things, in the early years of the hybrid formula when we didn't have a competitive power unit, which by the time they did get one, when they combined to make the whole thing awesome. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a disastrous thing. Obviously, they prefer to have a fully competitive power unit, but I think for where the team is at, it's not going to be the defining thing.
They also said they've moved the ERS battery back, the battery pack rearwards very slightly to help the weight distribution as well. One of the little detail they let slip. Yeah,
there's very little difference that you're allowed, but there's a certain range. It's very small in where you're allowed to have the weight distribution. It's not like it was back when Renault did the rearward heavy car in the early 2000s. But it's obviously where they want it and how they're trying to match it up with the centre of pressure.
Yeah, I think mechanically you're allowed about 1.5% of variation on the front, the load on the front. But the interesting thing about that is that it's actually when the car is leaving the garage in qualifying trim. So in other words, very low fuel or no fuel. It's not in race trim. So there is a combination of bits and pieces that you can do. For example, the fuel tank has got quite a big base in it. So if you were to able to move the ERS pack back a bit, you could drop the fuel tank down on the front, down around the front of that ERS pack. And if you could contain the qualifying fuel forward there, but your actual sort of mechanical weight of the battery pack is further rearward, then I think you could play sort of tunes on it as far as getting the weight distribution where you want it, which is as far forward as possible for qualifying, so you get the front tires working a bit earlier. And again, then when you fill the car full of fuel, the mass of that fuel actually drags the weight distribution rearward a little bit, so it can help in traction. So it's about playing. There's a tune to play there, I think, with weight distribution and the location of the fixed components, which is the ERS package, battery package, and then the unfixed, which is the amount of fuel you got in the car.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's all about these small details and how you distribute things for certain trims. So it's good they're looking at that sort of detail. Whether, of course, it's done to the optimum compromise is another question. Is there any other detail on this car that caught your eye before we talk more generally, Gary?
Well, we're just talking about the side pods, and obviously that's a big area, the side pod inlet and the side pod undercut. And for three cars that we've seen now, all of them look as though they've gone to this, which I've christened a duckbill radiator inlet. None of them really quite as exaggerated as the Red Bull was at the end of last year, because last year we saw Red Bull take 3 steps in that inlet. All of them getting exaggerating a little bit more, getting more airflow through that undercut, because it's that airflow through that undercut and the energy that's got that sort of helps work the side of the floor, and you need to sort of eliminate that flow through there from the tyre wake or eliminate it as best possible from the tyre wake. So the further away from the back of the tyre you can get it, the better that the energy will be in that flow. So yes, it's another part of it. They've done, in my book, 90% of what they probably you would classify as a major attempt at optimizing that area. I don't think they've done 100% by any means, but they're probably a little bit weary of just having enough cooling and taking that big step all at once. So I think there'll be developments in that area again, maybe exploiting it a little bit further whenever they sort of find their feet with where they really are. So there's that area. Down the side of the floor, they've gone to quite a lot of detail, very, very similar to Red Bull at the end of last season, with the longitudinal flap that's separated from the floor, gives a slot gap, so you get the airflow going through that slot gap, which keeps it from being an on-off switch when it gets near to the ground. So I think that area is all better, but whether it's better enough, that's another thing. If I go back to the sort of detail of the nose, because all the aerodynamic flow structure starts from way up there somewhere, I'm a little bit surprised by the fact that the nose, it just looks that little bit bulbous right at the front where the front wing joins it. Now, that's a sort of an area where it's a compromise between how bulbous it is and the material in there for the head-on impact test on the front of the car, relative to the structure of it and the mechanical properties of it, relative to the aerodynamic properties. But I'd say that it's as bulbous a nose in that area as anybody will have, and it does set up that flow structure through and over the underneath and over the top of the front wing that goes through between the front wheels and the inside of the chassis. And that's all the rest of the car's got to work with. So if you don't influence that correctly to begin with, you can end up in never really recovering further back, because you the flow structure at the front of the car affects the flow structure at the rear of the car.
I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility of seeing a slightly less bulbous nose later in the season. Obviously, it's quite a structural challenge to pass the crash test there, so maybe that's something they're looking at. The last thing I wanted to ask, Gary, is you weren't completely convinced with the approach they were taking generally with front wings. I know launch front wings are dangerous, but it looks like it's a little bit more in the kind of direction you'd want from what we've seen, perhaps, rather than all those... They had those different specs last year and the sort of the wavy top flaps and that kind of thing.
Well, I've never been a great fan of changing the detail of the flap. You've got to load it up somewhere. And back in the old days, if you go back to the, mid-90s, I suppose, we saw the flaps being worked very hard outboard and inboard, allowing the flow to get to the underfloor. But, that's sort of changed a little bit. But it's one of those sort of details where, again, on this car, they've got a reasonable amount of work being done, just in front of the front tyre. The flap, the trailing edge flap, its chord length there, and its height, and the main plane length, the forward flap of the front wing, the chord there is also quite long. And the big problem is that the front wheels are the one thing that isn't stable. As you go into a corner, depending upon how tight the corner is, the more steering lock you put on it. So if you've got a setup that's really working that part of the front wing, you will get an influence on it, a change on it with steering lock, with varying steering lock for every different corner. So I'm not sure they've gone away from their small changes in the trailing edge height that they had last year, which in my book, it sort of generates transient flow. You're working one part of it harder, the airflow from the other parts that aren't working so hard will head for there or be pulled there. So it's very difficult to manage that flow if you've got a big profile change in the trailing edge of the rear flap. It becomes quite difficult to sort of maintain good, consistent flow direction. So, maybe we'll see differences. Obviously the front wing, front nose, it's a bolt-on component. So I wouldn't be surprised if that'll get developed, quite soon.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Let's talk now, Mark, a little bit more generally, but Based on what you've seen from this car, the concept change, how they're talking about things, what are your expectations for Alpine this season? I guess no prizes for suggesting it'll be a little bit midfieldy, considering where they've been for the past few years.
Yeah, I think they've been quite aggressive in what they're trying to do, and they promise a very aggressive upgrade package through the season. But yeah, they're a long way behind. I mean, they're for quite a few seasons have been in that sort of thick end of a second off the front running pace, and contenders to be lapped before the end of the race. Now, I think the days of that level of performance getting you fourth or fifth in the Constructors' Championship's probably already over. I think you're going to need to close the gap more than that just to maintain that level in the championship. Fifth, sixth, that sort of level. But I think they need to have gained a lot of that performance that they're chasing just in order to stand still. And I don't see any reason why they won't do that, but I think the field will continue to compress in the third year of this formula. You would hope that everybody's sort of got the fundamentals now of why Red Bull had such a big advantage in the first 2 years, and then we're hearing a lot of talk now from various teams about the importance of suspension, and that's something that Red Bull talked about straight away back in 2022. So, I think that field's going to compress more, and so you would imagine they'll be in a similar sort of area to where they've been, but hopefully they can continue to make progress.
Yeah, that's the optimism they've got, that this is the right sort of direction and they can develop with this car over the next couple of years before the rule change. But whether that'll actually play out, only time will tell. Gary, what do you make of it? Do you find the car that they presented and the way they're talking about it technically convincing? Are you expecting much of a step forward from this team?
Well, I think it's a step better than what they had last year. I can see quite a lot of positives on the car. My biggest question is it enough? And that sort of depends on all the other teams, how deeply involved they get with their development, whether they really do push the boat out and start the season with a car that's a step ahead. This, I would imagine personally, that this is a better car for future development than the car they had last year. But if you do look at some of the details on it, the as I say, the side pods, they have a bit of a compromise between what we know the Red Bull has with the inlet, but they've also got their undercut, I suppose you might call that, gully down the inside of the side pod to get that air that gets pushed out of the radiator duct when the radiator can't flow anymore. That's the sort of air channel for that airflow to go in, and it takes it down into the middle of the car, which to talk about having high energy flow in the middle of the car is quite difficult because it's beaten to death by the time it gets there anyway. But you have to manage the flow that's there. So you want the flow that's actually, lost all its energy to go down into somewhere like that where you can't really use it as well as you'd like to. So they've got details on the car that are a different step, I suppose, to call it. You call it from what the Red Bull have shown as being the requirement over the last couple of seasons. But whether that all works together as one, it's a difficult thing because, as I say, the raised side pod with that undercut, with that gully on the inside of it, is a bit like what the Ferrari was in a way, and Ferrari went away from that. They've retained that this year. So it depends on how the whole thing works together. But looking at the car, I'm not seeing something that I would say they're going to be a Red Bull or a Mercedes or a Ferrari beater just yet. They've taken a step in the right direction, I think, and they've opened a few doors for themselves to develop better. But I haven't quite seen it all yet being, a package that will get them to the front of the grid. They're going to be in the midfield.
And certainly to give the team credit, Mark, they're kind of managing expectations, aren't they? They're not talking up the way the season will start. They think that there's, well, as Ben Ocon said, there's the risk that when you change concept, you have a little bit of a step back and then you start taking the steps forward. So do you think at least there's a sense of realism underpinning this team? I do, yeah. It's realism and with a purpose and to get themselves in shape ready for the formula change in 2026. So a big focus in Viri in the power unit centre, and
I think the aim at the Enstone part of the equation is to sort of try and get themselves state of the art on their side by the time that Viri has come up with the new concept for the new formula. They've made permanent the changes that they did last year in personnel. Bruno Famin's now permanent team principal and in charge of Viri as well as Enstone. Julian Rouse is the sporting director, and I hear good things about Bruno Famin in terms of his work ethic. He's hardly, his light's always on. Apparently, till no matter how late you leave, he's still there. And I don't imagine he's watching Netflix. I imagine he's doing some work. So. Julian Rouse, I got a lot of time for. I knew his dad, one of the legendary figures in touring car racing, Andy Rouse, and he's from the background of engineering. He's from a background of driver management. He was involved in the young driver development before this. He's got a good all-round set of experience to do a good job there, and I think he will. And so, yeah, I think now that it should have settled down after the upheaval of last year and late last year. I think they've got a good foundation there to, put something down and progress.
Well, that's pretty much the story for Alpine. Some interesting car changes. Not expecting any records to be broken, but hopefully a solid step forward for them. Thanks very much to Gary and Mark for your insight, and also to Damien Smith, who joined us for the first part of this podcast. Head to therace.com. Don't forget the hyphen, loads to read there, including Gary's in-depth analysis of the car. Check out our other podcasts, including the Race F1 Tech Show with Gary Anderson. There'll be a new series of that coming up in the not-too-distant future. Bring back V10s as well, and our MotoGP, IndyCar and Formula E podcasts. And also, if video's your thing, head to our YouTube channel. Well, launch season is coming thick and fast, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.